are in a new book, but essentially not. You've got to stop. You've got to cut a scroll in half somewhere, and the Samuel scroll gets cut right here. The book hasn't changed. The author hasn't changed. We're still continuing the same story that we looked at, that we've been looking at for weeks and months. We are in 2 Samuel chapter 1, and I think it's interesting to note, 1 Samuel is so beautifully put together. It begins with a song that sets the agenda for the whole book. And it ends with a song that reflects over those great themes we see in between. And right in the middle, there's another song that looks backward to what has come before and helps prepare us for what is to come. So it's a beautiful book that is highly structured. It's one of the books where songs play a critical role in the structure of the book itself. That would be true of Isaiah as well, Luke as well, and Revelation as well. But I want to begin not by reading 2 Samuel chapter 1, but by reading a poem by John McCrae. And some of you will be familiar with it, and if you're not, I think it will become familiar to you as you hear it. It's called In Flanders Fields. In Flanders Fields the poppies blow, between the crosses row on row, that mark our place, and in the sky the larks still bravely singing fly, scarce heard amid the guns below. We are the dead short days ago. We lived, felt dawn, saw sunsets glow. We loved and were loved, and now we lie in Flanders Fields. Take up our quarrel with the foe. To you from failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to hold it high. If ye break faith with us who die, we shall not sleep though poppies grow in Flanders Fields. Are you familiar with that poem? Would you give us some, Andrew, would you give us a little context on it if you happen to remember it? No problem if you don't. Right. It was written by a British soldier who was about my age, actually, who, after a battle where one of his friends died, he composed this poem after they were buried. They buried the dead, the British dead, the Allied dead, and very quickly the poppies began to grow over their graves, and he composed this striking poem which is meant to remember the dead. And every year in the UK, on the 11th month, on the 11th day of the month, on the 11th hour of that day, the UK stops. Like in the US on Memorial Day, we have sales on mattresses. Like in the UK on Memorial Day, the whole world, well, the whole British kingdom simply stops for a minute. And if you're in a car, you stop. If you're on the road, you stop. If you're in a store, you stop. And everybody is silent for 1 minute to commemorate. Initially, it was to commemorate those who died in World War I. And if you know anything about the British losses in World War I, they are staggering. And so it's a solemn moment. After World War II, those losses were sort of factored into that moment in the song. And now, in the UK, if you're there on November 11th at 11 p.m., they commemorate all their dead then. And it's a solemn moment. It's a sobering moment. It is a sacred moment in many respects. I don't think there's anything quite like that in the U.S. And here we see something like that in Israel's history. That's what 2 Samuel 1 is. It is in Flanders Fields, written by David at the most unbelievable time ever. I mean, that's what's so shocking about this poem. Not that it's not glorious and great and good, but when it's written. The chapter breaks down into two halves as you look at it. Really, there is the account of David hearing about the death of Saul and the defeat of Israel, and that's verses 1 to 16, and then 17 to the end is account of his grief. It's a hymn, a song of lamentation. It's his In Flanders Fields poem. And so let's dig into it and look at it together very quickly. So look with me at 2 Samuel chapter 1. And let's begin in verse 1. After the death of Saul, when David had returned from striking down the Amalekites, David remained 2 days in Ziklag. So this chapter begins with a reminder about where we are and when we are. Now, at the end of 1 Samuel, it's almost as if the screen gets split, and you have half the focus is on David and half of it's on Saul. David was initially swept up with the Philistines, almost pulled into battle, but then they rejected him. They went home to Ziklag, and what did they find when they got to Ziklag? Somebody had come and attacked it, stolen all their wives and children, carried them away. They wanted to kill David. David inquired of the Lord. He told them to pursue. They ran into an Egyptian who said it was the Amalekites. Then David went and won a smashing victory against the Amalekites. It's a big, important detail. David whips the Amalekites. Nobody is lost on their side. And almost everybody is lost on the other side. And they come back to Ziklag. And when we get there, there's celebration. There is food, there's joy. They were spared going into battle against Israel, which would have been catastrophic for David's ministry beyond that moment. They defeated the Amalekites. God was with them. Now they're in Ziklag. They're in Philistine territory celebrating. That's what's going on, right? Now, on the other half of the screen, what's going on? Saul has rejected the Lord and been rejected by the Lord. He goes to seek guidance from a medium, from a witch, from someone who practices divination. Samuel appears to him and says, you rejected God, God has rejected you. You're going to lead Israel in battle. You're going to be defeated, and you and your sons are going to die. And then the last chapter we looked at is the account of that thing. We saw Saul die. We saw his sons die, but that wasn't the end of the story. What happened at the end? The gospel of the idols, right? They took Saul's body, they mutilated it, they chopped it up, they put it in different trophy cases, and they pinned the rest of the corpse up to the wall, along perhaps with his sons' bodies as a trophy. And they were praising their gods and saying, Yahweh's a loser, Israel's a loser, the God of Israel is weak and lame, and we have defeated them, and they are celebrating too. So in one sense, you have these scenes of celebration. You have David celebrating in Ziklag. You have the Philistines celebrating in Philistia, and in the middle you've got all these dead Israelites. Sort of there. That's where we are. And David knows nothing about what's happened. It's not like you have instant news feeds or texts or anything like that. They are just celebrating and rejoicing, and things are going well and merry. They have no idea what happened on Mount Gilboa. And then comes verse 2. And on the third day, behold, a man came from Saul's camp, with his clothes torn and dirt on his head. And when he came to David, he fell to the ground and paid homage. So as they're celebrating and praising the Lord and eating and feasting and being reunited with their families, in comes somebody that's dressed really weird. Why does the author draw our attention to his clothes? Well, we don't yet know that, but you're right. What's that? He's in mourning. How do you know? Because he's got torn clothes and dirt on his head. Right? That's in the ancient world, you expressed mourning in that sort of way. We wear black. Victorians wore black. Here, they wore torn clothes. They didn't bathe. They didn't wash when they put dirt on their head. So somebody who's in mourning comes to David and pays homage. Now, is that action suggestive?
Yes.
What might it indicate?
A new king.
Maybe.
What was that?
A new king. So he greeted him like you would a king. And so here we have something that is a bit disturbing. If we're there, we see this man come perhaps tear-streaked, in mourning attire with dirt on his head, coming before David and falling down. And everybody's probably thinking, what does this mean? I wonder what this means. Does this mean it's over? Does this mean the fighting and running is done? Does this mean Saul is dead? And so let's look at what he reports. And David said to him, where have you come from? And he said to him, I have escaped from the camp of Israel. Now, the author of 2 Samuel is unfolding it sort of slowly in pieces. I've escaped from the camp of Israel. That can mean one of two things. What could that mean? Well, okay, maybe three things then. You came with something I didn't think of. It could mean that he's like a fugitive, right? That he was a soldier and he has abandoned his team and went to go hang out with David. What's another possible explanation for his presence there?
He's a Philistine running from an Israelite army.
Maybe. Right? Okay, there are way more possibilities than I thought of. I thought that there were really only two possibilities. Either this guy had escaped from Saul and was coming to David to join his team, or the language of escape implies something else. We got destroyed, and I alone survived to tell somebody about it. And that's the case. David said to him, "Where have you come from?" And he said to him, "I've escaped from the camp of Israel." David said to him, "How did it go? Tell me." David knows there was about to be a battle. Remember, he was almost pulled into it, and the king Achish wanted him to go in, but the other Philistine lord said, "Nope, go home." He went home. That's where all the events of chapters 29 and 30 took place. But David knew they were going off to battle, and so David wants to know, what happened? How did it go? And look at the language. Look at what he says. And he answered, "The people fled from the battle, and also many of the people have fallen and are dead." So God's people have been defeated in battle. Saul and his son Jonathan are also dead. So here's this news. Israel's been defeated by the Philistines, the team he almost worked for, that Saul and Jonathan are dead. I wonder how that struck David. I mean, I think we know, but if we didn't know and we were sitting right here, I wonder how his men felt when they heard this news. What had David been doing for the last year and a half? Not year and a half. He's been living in Ziklag for a year and a half, but what has he been doing for the last decade or so? Running from this guy who's now dead. Yeah, Jonathan is a huge loss, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But what does Jonathan represent to the man delivering the news? So the man delivering the news, I think he knows David. I think he knows about David. I think David knows he knows about him. But what, in terms of Israel's political structure, Saul is the king, and what does Jonathan represent? The next in line, the heir to the throne of the prince. And so this guy is bringing him news that I think he thinks David will like. The king is dead, and so is his heir. And the young man, then he asked him, David said to the young man who told him, "How do you know that Saul and his son Jonathan are dead?" So, how do I know you're telling the truth? How did you know? Did you hear this from somebody? Were you there? Explain to me how you came by this critical information. And look at what he says. And the young man who told him said, "By chance, I happened to be on Mount Gilboa, and there was Saul leaning on his spear, and behold, the chariots and the horsemen were close upon him. And when he looked behind him, he saw me, and he called to me. And I answered, 'Here I am.' And he said to me, 'Who are you?' And I answered him, 'I'm an Amalekite.' And he said to me, 'Stand beside me and kill me, for anguish has seized me, and yet my life still lingers.' So I stood beside him and killed him, because I was sure that he could not live after he had fallen. And I took the crown that was on his head and the armlet that was on his arm, and I have brought them here to my Lord." So he comes into the camp in mourning clothes and says, "Saul is dead, Jonathan is dead, Israel's been defeated. How do I know? I was there. I just happened to be on Mount Gilboa." Now, does that sound a little fishy? Okay, it sounds a little fishy. Okay, so it's like, I just happened to be walking through an active battlefield, right? Had my metal detector looking for coins. There happened to be a battle raging all around me, and here's King Saul leaning on his spear, mortally wounded. And I saw that, and he called to me and told me to kill him, and so I did. Brought you the crown and the armlet, symbols of his rule and reign. And so he brings them to David. Now, why would he bring them to David? Because he knows all of this. He knows the backstory here. He knows who David is, and he wants to bring him these implements, these emblems, these symbols of Israel's kingship, because he knows that David is now, or should now be, the king. Now, here's the question. What are we to make of this story? It obviously contradicts the one of 1 Samuel 31. So let's imagine you're reading this with an unbelieving friend, neighbor. And you read 1 Samuel 31 that recounts the death of Saul. And you read 2 Samuel 1, which recounts the death of Saul. And they say different and contradictory things. What are the big points of contradiction or contention here? Where is it not lining up?
How he died.
Right. So in chapter 31, there are some elements are the same. There are chariots. There's Saul was mortally wounded. The forces are swarming in. In chapter 31, Saul asks his armor bearer to kill him, who refuses. And so Saul takes his own life by falling on his own sword, and then the armor bearer does the same. Then his body is taken, mutilated, displayed in trophy cases. Here, it's not Saul who kills him. Saul doesn't kill himself. Rather, it's the Amalekite who does it for him at the request of King Saul. And so he does it. He's just obeying orders, and he brings the crown and armlet to Israel's king. Now, there's obvious contradiction. Both of these stories cannot be true. Right? They can't be. Either Saul took his own life, or he didn't. Or the Amalekite took Saul's life, or he didn't. How do we make sense of these two seemingly contradictory accounts? Anyway?
I think David should be suspicious because he said, I just happened to be.
Yeah, that sounds a little fishy. So maybe that calls into question the truthfulness of the second account. Maybe so. Are Amalekites good guys? Not at all. No. Not at all. Okay, so we've got reason to question the truthfulness of that witness. How else might you explain this to somebody who is saying, "Hey, see, look, the Bible contradicts itself right here. Obviously, it does. See, people do this with the resurrection all the time. They say, "Oh, well, this one says that so and so came to the tomb, and this one says so and so came to the tomb, and they're different, and so therefore it's contradictory." Well, the way you treat the gospel accounts is harmonizing them. You can't harmonize this. There's obvious contradiction here. Is this an example of the Bible being hopelessly contradictory? No. The person who put together Samuel's dead, perhaps Nathan is putting this together after him, Nathan's not an idiot. You understand that, right? Nathan's not a dummy. He knows that these accounts aren't the same. And so do we have to jump to the conclusion that the Bible is hopelessly contradictory? No. And how does this is a big point. How does historical narrative work? Does it always tell you when somebody's lying? No. Sometimes Abraham says stuff like, "Hey, that's my sister." And the Bible never says, "And she wasn't." But we know she wasn't, right? That's how historical narratives work. They don't interject and say, "He's lying, he's lying, he's lying." They faithfully record unfaithful truths. Not truths. They faithfully record lies. They truthfully record the lies of others. They do this here. They'll do that with David. David will lie. He did lie and has lied before, and the Bible never said, "And no, he didn't." This guy is lying. We have reason to doubt his account because of this language. Well, I just happened to be walking through an active battlefield and that sort of thing. So what do you think really happened? Why is this guy here? If it didn't go that way, if it really went the way 1 Samuel 31 says it did, then how do you explain this story? What is this guy up to?
Favor in the future.
The future king.
So he knows where to go. He knows that David's the man. He knows David's next in line for the crown. He happens to, I think he's probably, after the battle, before the Philistines find Saul's corpse, he sees Saul's dead body and says, "Yes, I got a shot now. I'm going to take a shot. I'm going to grab this crown and this armlet, these symbols of Saul's throne, and I'm going to take him to David. And I'm going to tell David, in a very polite, respectful sort of way, I killed the guy who's trying to kill you. I did it in a respectful way. He asked me to do it. I'm not really guilty of murder, but he asked me to do it, and so I did it. And now you're king. And here's your crown. And here's your armlet. And aren't I a faithful guy?" Aren't I your ally? Aren't I your man? Now reward me with positions and power. You know, how do kings like the world work, according to 1 Samuel 8? What do? They take, and give to their friends. And this guy's assuming David's going to work that way. He's going to be one who will be happy to reward loyalty, even dishonest sort of loyalty. And so that's what I think is going on here. The Bible's not contradicting itself. We know the real account in 1 Samuel 31. This other one sort of helps us see someone trying to take an opportunity, take an advantage, to worm himself into a position of power and authority at Saul's expense. But there is a great irony at work, is there not? Saul lost his crown to an Amalekite twice. Right? Why did he lose his crown in chapter 15? Get kicked off the throne once. When the Lord rejected him, why did he reject him? He didn't kill the Amalekites. He lost his crown to an Amalekite. And now literally he loses his crown to the Amalekites. Isn't it interesting? Rather than killing the Amalekites, he plundered them. And now what happens here in Saul's life? They didn't kill him, but they plundered him. And back in chapter 15, when Samuel comes and says, "Hey Saul, how did the battle go?" And he said, "Wonderful, killed them all. Destroyed everything, devoted to destruction." What did Samuel say? "And why do I hear all these animals? And what's Agag doing here?" See, he claimed to have wiped them out, but he actually didn't do it. Now here you have an Amalekite claiming to wipe Saul out, but he didn't actually do it. It's some ironies at work here. And that brings us to verses 11 to 16, which is all about reversals. Now, again, if we didn't know very much, we might expect David to respond to this news how? Even if you knew this guy's a liar. Right? They've been celebrating a great victory. They have been. They defeated the Amalekites in a miraculous sort of way. David has a clear path to the throne, an unobstructed path to the throne. No more running, no more waiting, no more hiding in caves, no more protecting ungrateful farmers for food. I mean, you might expect it to be somewhat like the beginning of The Wizard of Oz. When the house lands on the Wicked Witch of the East, what do people do? Wizard of Oz. They sing. You know, ding dong, the witch is dead. Yeah, that whole number, right? You might expect a moment like that in their life. But that's not how David responds. Look at what he does in verse 11. And David took hold of his own clothes, and tore them, as did all the men who were with him. And they mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and for Jonathan his son and for the people of the Lord and for the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. I don't know if we sufficiently understand the magnitude of what just happened in chapter 31. What are the great losses in U.S. history? Like great military losses? Depending on what side you're on, the Battle of Vicksburg would be a catastrophic loss for the South. At the beginning of the Civil War, what were the campaigns in Virginia by the Army of the Northern Virginians, who defeated a lot of Union troops early on? Those were terrible losses there. Bull Run, another one. Right, those were two terrible losses. Pearl Harbor was a national tragedy. 9/11, in a different sort of way, is a national tragedy. The initial campaigns of World War II, in which the Americans were involved in North Africa, they got beaten roundly in North Africa by Rommel and others, at least until Patton got there. So there have been moments in U.S. history where the U.S. has been smashed in the mouth, and everybody mourns. Like, that's what's happening on Mount Gilboa. They lose a king, they lose an heir, their armies lose, they lose land, and the Philistines run in and take the place. This is a terrible disaster for Israel, one of the worst defeats in their history. It's like our Pearl Harbor, 9/11, or Battle of Vicksburg for the South, for example. Isn't it amazing how quickly fortunes can turn? I mean, that's one of the sad lessons of 2 Samuel chapter 1, is that in chapters 29 and 30 of the last book, David goes from mourning right? My men want to kill me, to joy after a great victory. And within the space of 2 days, what happens? Completely flipped around. Going from great joy back to what? To mourning. That's a normal experience for God's people, I think. I remember reading a letter C.S. Lewis wrote about he lost a friend in World War I, speaking of World War I, a guy named Patty Moore. You know this story? Patty Moore was a trench buddy of his, and they made the vow to take care of each other's family. C.S. Lewis's mother had already died, but Patty promised to take care of Lewis's father if Lewis died and he survived, and Lewis promised to take care of Patty Moore's mother if he died and Lewis survived. Well, he died and Lewis survived, and Lewis cared for her for 37 years. She blamed the Lord for her son's death. She hated Lewis's conversion to Christianity, and Lewis, while his writing career began to explode and his speaking career began to explode, and he grew as this great evangelical leader, he wrote to his brother and says, like, every time I come home, I wonder what disaster awaits me. You can have, on the one hand, in Lewis's life, great spiritual success, great professional success, and then he comes home he fears coming home to a complete reversal, disaster. There's that mix of mourning and joy and mourning. I think that's going to be one of the great joys of the new heavens, new earth, is just the unendingness of joy. Because I don't know about you, but when I experience really happy moments, two things always intrude on them. One, I wish this would last forever, and it won't. And then the idea of what's coming next. They always come intrude and ruin our joy as believers for a time. And we feel these reversals. We see and experience these reversals in our own lives. David certainly did. And thankfully they'll come to an end in the new heavens and new earth. Why do you think David mourned the death of Saul? Given Saul's murderous, satanically inspired, remember he's possessed by a devil, or the devil, some of the time, and he functions as an antichrist, right? Remember we looked at John that said, and many antichrists will come, and they have come, and Saul, I think, embodies that anti-Christian office. Given who Saul is, a murderous, satanically inspired, anti-Christian persecutor of David who's been hunting him to the death for 10 to 15 years, why would David be sad about this?
One, the same reason you didn't kill him while he was in the bathroom. He was trying to let the king. Number two, he was his father-in-law.
Yeah, lots of interesting personal connections. Would someone go to Proverbs 24:17? I know this hasn't been written yet. Would someone turn to Proverbs 24:17 and read that for us? I know I would be very tempted to rejoice and throw a party if someone who's been hunting me to death for more than a decade. He was.
Anointed.
He was. As was David. Although he was rejected. He was God's reject for 15 years.
But he was still doing what God anointed him to do at that time.
Saul was? I don't think God anointed Saul to kill David.
No, but I mean, whatever Saul, even though he was anointed by God as king, he still didn't do what all the things he was supposed to do as king, being anointed by God.
Oh,
but
for
he
sure.
was still doing what God had, just like Pharaoh.
Yeah. Yes,
You see,
but the way he's serving God is very different. Right? So rather than actively serving God as a servant of the Lord, he's actively opposing God, and his opposition is being used by God. But I guess, you can make the same sense if somebody's been trying to kill you for 15 years. God's sovereign, he's in control, and he's a God of providence. So when that person dies, I guess you could be, well, glad that's over. Right? You would almost imagine some sense of really. Would someone read Proverbs 24:17?
Rejoice not when thy enemy falleth, and let not thy heart be glad when he stumbleth.
Wow. Don't rejoice when your enemy falls. That's a hard word.
Saul was his king. he knew Saul from the very beginning. Saul had very many problems in the very beginning. He needed someone to soothe the savage beast. You know, he came in, he would sing, he put poetry, and he'd play his harp, and he went through the whole scene with Saul. Saul had a lot of issues. And he had a lot of issues, and he learned to love him. It's like it could happen today so easily. Think about it.
Yeah, I just think that David is showing some spiritual depth here that is rare. Showing some spiritual depth that's incredibly rare, in the sense that the stakes were so high. I mean, God's king was supposed to do two things: rescue for God, rule for God. Saul has given that up a long time ago, and he's devoted all his attention on killing David. Like, that's been his life's mission for forever, for the last 15 years, and he wants David dead. And remember, over and over again, David said things like, I'm not going to strike him because the Lord may take him out. Maybe in battle or by an enemy. Or maybe I get sick like Nabal and die. And, when you read something like that, you think, well, David says that and he believes that, and I do, and he does. And David's going to be relieved when he dies, when he does. What's amazing is that David doesn't seem happy about it. And I think that's quite remarkable.
Where he's going to be in eternity, like he's going to grieve
That's what I was
Absalom later on in 2 Samuel.
I don't know what David knew. I don't think there's any sign of hope for Saul. At least as far as the scriptures record his life for us. Basically, after chapter 18 of 1 Samuel, the only thing Saul's concerned about is killing David. That's it.
Jonathan, because he's so close to Jonathan, and they both passed away.
Yeah, well, the loss of Jonathan is going to be very personal, and he's going to commemorate that in Psalm later on. And amazingly, Saul's death too. He's a remarkable man. Let's see what happens. Let's move quickly through what happens next. Now you have David. His first act as king is to serve as judge. That's what judges do. They presided over hard court cases. Here's a hard court case. So David took off his clothes and tore them, as did all the men who were with him. They mourned and wept and fasted until evening for Saul and Jonathan and his son, for the people of the Lord and the house of Israel, because they had fallen by the sword. And David said to the young man who told him, "Where did you come from?" And he answered, "I am the son of a sojourner." Okay, you know about sojourners, resident aliens, pilgrims. He's the son of an Amalekite who lived in Israel. He knew David, he knew David's story, he knew Saul's story. That's why he knows where to go and what to do and those sorts of things. I'm the son of a sojourner, an Amalekite. Now, that's really interesting information, is it not? And David said to him, "How is it that you were not afraid to put your hand to destroy the Lord's anointed?" In other words, you shouldn't have done this. And you know you shouldn't have done this. I'd never have done this. You think you're doing this for me? I had the opportunity many times and never did. Then David called one of the young men and said to him, "Go execute him." And he struck him down so that he died. And David said to him, "Your blood be on your own head, for your own mouth has testified against you. I have killed the Lord's anointed." Okay. So here's the question. We got lots of questions in this chapter. Was that act just? Was that execution just? Now, let's acknowledge that we're not talking about 21st century Western democracy or justice, but was David's action just? Yes or no?
No.
Okay, we got the two options out there. We got a yes and we got a no. Give me the no case. Why shouldn't he have done that?
When we were talking a minute ago, is how David felt, Saul and all that, should he have rejoiced and all that. The thing that came to my mind immediately was, do we think that Christ was joyful and happy when Judas killed himself? I think not.
Okay, yeah, so we can understand David's grief over Saul in the same way we would understand Jesus not rejoicing in the destruction of Judas.
over his death, you know. I mean, God doesn't want anyone to fail.
Right. The Bible says God doesn't rejoice over the destruction of the wicked. But what about what David did with the Amalekite? So you mentioned that you thought it was just. Why is it just? Why is this not an unjust action by God's king?
They put it together. He probably knew he was lying. Plus, that was a king. No matter what the circumstances, he still dishonored them.
Here, I'm going to give you my case for it being just, and I agree with you on that. Here's my case for being just. Number one, the Amalekites were under the ban. From chapter 15, that was a devote to destruction, all of them order. Saul did not carry it out, and it cost him in the end. But that ban has not been lifted, and the Amalekites are still under it. Secondly, what has David been doing in the previous chapter? 2 chapters ago. He's been doing what God called Saul to do, but he refused to do. He has been devoting the Amalekites to the band. Also, the man who was executed confessed to committing a capital offense. Don't kill the Lord's anointed. And David didn't know he was lying. Not for a fact. I mean, he didn't have 1 Samuel 31 to say, no, you didn't, because I read here that this is how it went down. Here you have someone saying, I killed Saul. Here's his stuff. Here's proof. David, you have
Exodus 21:12 says, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. So whether he did it or not, he confessed that he did. So he should have killed him.
Right. So for those reasons, for me, for the Amalekites under the ban, David's been carrying that out successfully, as God commanded Saul to do, and he refused to. He confessed to committing a capital offense, and David didn't know otherwise. And the man testified against himself. This isn't hearsay. He's saying, I did this thing. It's interesting. So David becomes officially the king by doing what Saul refused to do, by killing Amalekites. And his first official act is a lamentation. Is that interesting to you? I think it's interesting that the first thing he does officially as king is lament. How are we doing on time? We'll move kind of quickly through this. Let me read it for you very quickly, and then I'll make a few comments as we move through it. And David lamented with this lamentation over Saul and Jonathan, his son. It's amazing to me that he would do this thing. And he said it should be taught to the people of Judah. In other words, what he's doing is not just, this is how I feel about this bad moment. I'm writing this for all Israel to learn. And they do this, you understand. Like in Israel, do you know how military works? Like it's when you turn 18 or 20, you get conscripted into the military. And at the end of basic training, you go to Masada. That was a place where the Romans cornered them at the end of, I think, the first Jewish-Roman war. And 900 soldiers were in Herod's old palace and surrounded by the Romans, and they were going to fight to the last man. And so the Romans said, okay. They built a 9-foot wall all around the entire complex, then built up a giant highway to the top of the place to go kill them all. And when they came up there, they all jumped off the edge of the cliff, dying rather than serving as slaves. But this song is still memorized by Israeli soldiers today, used in their sort of graduation ceremony when they become soldiers. It's still taught today. And it's written in the book of Jashar, literally the book of the upright. We don't own this book. We don't possess this book. It was likely a record of upright people and upright deeds. That's what the word Jashar means, upright. And here's this lamentation. Your glory, O Israel, is slain on your high places. How the mighty have fallen. Tell it not in Gath. Publish it not in the streets of Ashkelon. Lest the daughters of the Philistine rejoice. Lest the daughters of the uncircumcised exult. You mountains of Gilboa, let there be no dew or rain upon you, nor fields of offerings. For there the shield of the mighty was defiled, and the shield of Saul not anointed with oil. From the blood of the slain, from the fat of the mighty, the bow of Jonathan turned not back, and the sword of Saul returned not empty. Saul and Jonathan, beloved and lovely, in life and in death they were not divided. They were swifter than eagles. They were stronger than lions. You daughters of Israel, weep over Saul, who clothed you luxuriously in scarlet, who put ornaments of gold on your apparel. How the mighty have fallen in battle, in the midst of the battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. Now it becomes personal. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant have you been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war perished. Okay, very quickly, David mourns for 3 things in this hymn. The first, I think, is the most important. Your glory, O Israel, lies slain on your high places. What's he referring to? What's the glory of Israel? The Lord. Remember the first thing David said? First recorded words of Scripture. He shows up in 1 Samuel 17. And what does he speak about? Why is nobody doing anything about these Philistines? They're dishonoring God. He is mourning the Lord's dishonor. Remember what's going on in Philistia? Right? It's the day of the gospel of the idols. Right? Saul's body is being carried in parade. His body's being nailed up. They are celebrating. They are chanting, the Lord is a loser. Yahweh, Jehovah, is a loser. The God of Israel is a loser. He's a false God. He's an idol. He is not true. He's not worthy. He's not good. He's not right. Dagon and Ashtaroth are the ones the whole world ought to serve. Now, we know that's not the case. We know that for two reasons. Number one, Hannah's song has come true. What are the four themes of this book? What does God do to the proud? He humbles him. Has a proud person been humbled in these chapters? Saul is dead. Has a humble person been exalted? Yes. David's now king. Has the Lord demonstrated that He's in control of history? Has He raised up and anointed a Christ and a Messianic king? Yes. We also know that God's word through Samuel came true. What did Samuel say to Saul when he went to consult the medium? You're going to die and you're going to lose. What has happened? You die and you lose. But here's the tragedy. Everybody thinks Dagon won. Everybody thinks Dagon rules. Everybody thinks those gods are right and true and good. We know they're idols. We know their gospel is false gospel. But nobody knows it. Because Israel has been defeated in this horrible way, and their king has been defeated in this horrible way, and he has brought all this on himself in Israel. Right? What is the battle plan for winning the promised land? Very simple. Love and trust the Lord, and who wins your battles? He does. Don't love and trust the Lord, and what happens? You lose. And Israel has lost. And the first thing David mourns for is God's glory. Do we ever do that? No, I don't want to do the shame fest thing, but we mourn over things. We do. We mourn over the political condition of our country. We mourn over the social condition of our country. We mourn over social evils. We mourn over political defeats. We mourn over sports teams when they lose. Do we ever mourn over God's glory? You know, I mentioned it this morning. I don't know if you were talking about the SBC and the sex abuse scandal and that report that came out a few weeks ago. You understand that enemies of the Lord are rejoicing. That's where evangelical religion leads. That's where complementarianism leads. That's what 1 Peter 3 means. That's what submission in marriage does. That's what the enemies of God are saying. Right? Everywhere. I told you so. This is what they're really like. This is what evangelical Christians are really like. Their leaders are corrupt. Pastors are corrupt. Church leaders, Sunday school teachers, elders, deacons, they are corrupt. They are evil. They are abusers and users. I told you. They're no different than Harvey Weinstein. They are Harvey Weinstein. Just in a church. That's what the enemies of the truth say. They rejoice over these things. Do we mourn for God's glory? We have cause to. Do we mourn over our own sin and the loss of God's glory that comes with it? Again, it's not about a shame fest. We have that word reformed on our church sign. And people connect reformed with Westminster Catechism. Right? You all know, perhaps you've heard at least, what's the very first question of the Westminster Shorter Catechism? What is the chief end of man? What is it? To glorify God and enjoy him forever. I wonder, do we ask ourselves, what is the chief end have been? To glorify God and enjoy him forever? Those aren't the same questions. Because oftentimes, my chief end and that chief end are different. And when I don't glorify God, do I mourn over it? You know, when medieval theologians thought about repentance, they thought about it in terms of a few C words. One of them is confession. You confess it. There's another word that they used, I think, that we should recover, and that's contrition. It's a combination of two Latin words, con, which is cum or with, and triste, which means sadness. Sadness. I think it would be right and good and biblical for God's people to mourn over God's glory that is being diminished, not in and of itself. That cannot be done by humans. God's glory is what it is, no matter who or what sees it. But in terms of the world, it's brought into disrepute by God's people sometimes. And I think that's a reason to mourn. And I want to challenge you. It's a weird application, isn't it? Let me challenge you to mourn over what is appropriately mournful. Yeah.
I've never heard anyone verbalize mourning the glory of God. Never.
Well, David does it right here. I mean, the glory of Israel is not Saul.
I have never heard anyone verbalize the loss of glory to God.
Well, you want to hear it again?
Loss of glory for God.
Right. So David is doing that here. David will do it on a personal level. In Psalm 51, after Bathsheba, he'll say, "Against you and you alone have I sinned, and done what is evil in your sight." So I do think that's an appropriate response. That certainly what David's doing that's what he's doing. He calls Israel to mourn over Saul. Now, we've already talked about this a little bit, but I just want you to think about what he says about the man who, under Satan's influence, has been trying to kill him for 15 years. He calls him mighty, swift, and a strong warrior. All he records are good things, like his successes in battle, even though most of the battles that Saul has fought, at least that are recorded in the Bible, are against David, trying to kill him. He calls him beloved and lovely, united together with Jonathan, whom he tried to kill for helping David. And he mentions that he provided well for God's people. I don't know if I could write that kind of lament over people who hate me.
It seems apparent that Saul truly felt David to be his enemy.
For sure.
David never felt that way about Saul. It was a loss to him. He was David's enemy, but not in David's mind. Saul was trying to take out the enemy in his mind.
I mean, that's part of the tragedy of it all.
It's from the very beginning.
I start with lost donkeys. That's right. Saul is a tragic figure in the Bible, and I think he's one that we're given so much ink over that we need to look at it carefully. There's one more person that's mourned over here, and that's Jonathan. It's a touching tribute. Theirs is one of the most famous friendships in antiquity. It says he's distressed over my brother. And so it goes from sort of the focus on Israel and Israel's loss and Saul's goodness to Israel to David's personal loss over Jonathan. He says something. He says that your love was pleasant, exceedingly dear. That's the idea there. And he says to me, your love was extraordinary. It was. You had unusual and extraordinary love for Jonathan did for David, and David did for Jonathan. We don't have time to recap that friendship, but I hope you remember those great moments. They had the same sort of heart to venture off for the Lord. They loved one another. They made a covenant together. They showed covenant faithfulness one to another. And then he has this phrase which raises an issue I'd rather not talk about, but we need to talk about, and that is, he says, surpassing the love of women. And this raises the issue of homosexual relationships. Modern commentators today, some argue that this indicates that David and Jonathan had that sort of relationship. In fact, they treat this passage as something of a proof text. And the question before us is this: does it support that? Does this support that?
Point of view.
I'm going to try to make a case from the Bible's point of view, as best I can, that reading is utterly alien to 2 Samuel chapter 1. I'm going to make a case that this is utterly, absolutely foreign. Number one, Genesis 2 still exists. Genesis 19 still exists. The book of Leviticus still exists. Those things haven't gone anywhere. If David and Jonathan had this sort of relationship, it would have been a national scandal. That nobody would have sat by and said, oh, well, you love who you love. Nobody would have said that. God's word says no to these things. There would have been a scandalous, terrible sort of sin. David does have problems with sexual sin in terms of polygamy and adultery, but not homosexual lust or practice. I think it's worth remembering here that friendship in the ancient world is a much bigger deal to them than it is to us. You go read Nicomachean Ethics by Aristotle. Go read Eudaimonean Ethics by Aristotle. For them, the ultimate blessing in life is to share and enjoy and be virtuous with another friend. Like they view friendship in far more profound terms than we do. So it shouldn't surprise us that the Bible describes this remarkable ancient friendship in remarkable and profound terms. Furthermore, we are, just as they are much more interested in friendship than we are, we're much more interested in sexuality than they were. We define everything in those terms. We've done, really, if you can sort of talk about, you can look at this through Nietzsche and Marx and Freud to today. That's what Carl Trueman adds. Basically, Nietzsche told us to sort of rethink identity altogether. Marx said you're not really human, you're an economic unit. Freud said you're not an economic unit, you are a sexual unit. And since that time, people have defined their identity by their sexuality. Like, that's not happening in 10th century BC. Friendship was far more bigger than sexuality then. I think this is an indictment on our whole... I think their friendship is an indictment on our shallow, hollow friendships. The fact that we have to call that sexual just shows that we don't really have deep relationships, I think. And then finally, if tonight's going to be poetry night, let me borrow another poem from Henry V's William Shakespeare. You'll know this line, but I think it may drive the point home. They're about to go, Henry and the English are about to begin the battle of, come on, how am I drawing a blank here? Agincourt. And he has that St. Crispin's Day speech. He says this: "We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he never so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed that they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap while any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's Day." Here's something that Shakespeare is putting his finger on, that the ancients put their finger on, that there are relationships that develop, particularly in battle, between fellow soldiers that just transcend normal relationships. Now, I've never been in battle, so I don't have a point of contact here. You may. If you've seen the Band of Brothers series, that's a powerful series. It gets its title from this hymn. But I went to seminary with brothers who fought in Iraq and Afghanistan, and they speak about these sorts of friendships and relationships that develop in the context of war that transcend ordinary relationships. And I think what he's just trying to say is that our friendship was something beyond any other relationship that I've experienced. Does that make it sexual in any way? No. It just makes it way deeper and way more profound than we tend to think about it. So he mourns over God's glory. He mourns over Saul. He mourns over Jonathan. And that brings this sad chapter to an end. But I do think it points us forward to another king and another death, another seeming defeat that doesn't injure God's glory but displays it more magnificently than any other moment in human history. Those of you who are studying John's Gospel, you'll know that the John's Gospel is built around 7 signs. And there's this pattern that emerges with these signs. First, there's the sign, the miracle. Then there's the revelation of Christ's glory. And then it inspires faith. There's 7 of those in John's Gospel. And then there's the big 8th one. The one that outstrips and outshines them all. The last one, the 7th one, being the resurrection of Lazarus. So there's something even bigger than the resurrection of Lazarus. Some sign that points to Jesus' true identity. Some display of glory that's more magnificent than anything we've ever seen. Something that's meant to inspire our faith. And what is that? It's the death of the King and his resurrection. He doesn't diminish God's glory, but it displays it more fully than any moment before. So in some sense, that is the death of and resurrection of Christ is the anti 2 Samuel chapter 1. And I hope as we sort of think through the mournful parts of this, we'll remember the joyful parts of that. Well, let's pray and close it up for the night. Heavenly Father, we give you thanks for your word and for this remarkable and challenging portion of it. Lord, we give you thanks for this challenge to mourn well and rightly over the loss of your glory in our land. We know, Lord, because of your people, even because of me, because of us at times, your enemies rejoice. And we lament that fact. And we mourn it. And we ask you to forgive us, and we pray that bitter taste of mourning in our mouth would spur us on to new obedience and faithfulness. We thank you, O Lord, that you're a God of providence and that none of these things happened by chance. We thank you that you use these things to teach us and instruct us and point us to another king, another defeat, another death that ultimately brings you and us a great glory, even the death and resurrection of your Son. It's in his name we pray.